Welcome to Eternal Darkness, where nightmares come to life. I'll be your host through these twisted tales tonight. Before we descend into the shadows, remember to like and subscribe to join our growing community of horror enthusiasts. Get comfortable, turn down the lights, and prepare yourself as we begin our journey into the unknown. When I was a young adult, my parents bought a beautiful cabin where they ended up spending every summer. From mid-spring to late fall, they would stay at this cabin, returning home only for the winter, since the cabin wasn't winterized. Their cabin is located in New Hampshire, on a road that borders Crystal Lake. Being big fans of horror, my wife and I always joked about the lake's eerie name, though we never imagined how prophetic that observation would prove to be. At 37 years old, I have what most would consider a wonderful life. My beautiful wife of 14 years, and our 5 children. However, years ago, something happened that fundamentally changed how I view the world around us. For context, I follow a Satanist philosophy. No, we don't engage in the ritualistic nonsense you see in horror movies. I love my family deeply, enjoy scary films, I'm an avid gamer, and I've always believed in things that exist beyond our normal understanding, the paranormal, unexplained phenomena, creatures that science hasn't yet cataloged. The cabin itself sits on roughly 3 acres, surrounded by dense New Hampshire forest that stretches for miles in every direction. Built in the 1970s, it's a modest 2-bedroom structure with knotty pine walls and large windows that offer stunning views of the lake during the day. But at night, those same windows become dark portals that seem to invite whatever lurks in the shadows to peer inside. The nearest neighbor is nearly a mile away, accessible only by a winding dirt road that becomes treacherous after rain. My parents chose this location specifically for its isolation, wanting a retreat from the chaos of modern life. They never mentioned any strange occurrences, never hinted at anything unusual about the property. In retrospect, I wonder if they simply didn't notice, or perhaps they chose not to acknowledge what was already there, waiting. Though I've experienced minor paranormal events throughout my life, doors opening on their own, unexplained sounds, objects moving when no one was near them, nothing substantial ever happened to me until that incident at the cabin. These earlier experiences were easily dismissed, explained away by logical reasoning or simply ignored. A draft could open a door. Old houses make settling noises. Memory can play tricks when you're tired. But looking back now, I recognize a pattern. These incidents always occurred in remote locations, places where civilization thinned and the natural world pressed closer. The cabin represented the perfect storm of isolation, history, and something else. Something I couldn't name then but can feel now, like a constant weight pressing against my consciousness. Occasionally, my wife and I would arrange with my parents to stay at the cabin while they returned to their primary residence. This arrangement worked well for everyone. My parents could handle business at home, and we could enjoy a peaceful retreat. The cabin is close enough to my workplace that I don't need to schedule time off, making these extended stays practical rather than burdensome. These visits were always memorable for their tranquility and natural beauty. We'd spend days hiking the surrounding trails, teaching our children to identify different bird calls and tree species. Evenings were for board games by the fireplace and early bedtimes that came naturally with the absence of city distractions. I thought I understood what made the cabin special. I was wrong. The last time this arrangement happened, we had only 2 children. My son was around 9 or 10, and my daughter was around 4 or 5. Both were at ages where their imaginations ran wild, where the line between reality and fantasy blurred in ways that adults often envy. They loved the cabin as much as we did, though for different reasons. To them, it was a magical place where they could explore endless forests and swim in the crystal-clear lake. We packed up our car with enough supplies for a week-long stay, and made the 3-hour drive north. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the scent of dying leaves and wood smoke from distant chimneys. As we pulled into the gravel driveway, I felt the familiar sense of peace that always accompanied our arrivals. The cabin looked exactly as it always had, welcoming, safe, a perfect refuge from the world's complications. That first night we established our usual routines. The children claimed their beds in the guest room, arguing playfully over who got which window view. My wife and I settled into the master bedroom, whose windows faced the forest rather than the lake. We'd always preferred this view, finding something soothing about the way moonlight filtered through the tree branches, creating shifting patterns on the bedroom walls. Everything seemed perfect, normal, exactly as it should be. The children fell asleep easily, exhausted from the drive and the excitement of being back at their favorite place. My wife and I stayed up later, reading by lamplight and enjoying the profound silence that only true wilderness can provide. We had no idea that we were being observed, studied, perhaps even selected. The first few days passed without incident, filled with the simple pleasures that made these cabin stays so precious to our family. We hiked familiar trails, collected interesting rocks and leaves, and spent hours on the lake in the small rowboat my parents kept tied to their dock. My children's laughter echoed across the water, a sound so pure and joyful that it seemed to sanctify the entire landscape. But as the week progressed, I began to notice subtle changes in the atmosphere around the cabin. Animals that had always been abundant, squirrels, chipmunks, various songbirds, seemed to disappear. The forest, which had always hummed with life, grew increasingly quiet during daylight hours. At night, the silence became so complete it felt oppressive, as if something had frightened away every living creature for miles. My wife noticed it too, though we didn't discuss it until much later. Instead, we made silent adjustments to our routines. We stayed closer to the cabin during our walks. We brought the children inside earlier each evening. We found ourselves glancing toward the tree line more frequently, though neither of us could explain what we expected to see. The children, with their uncanny ability to sense adult anxiety, began asking questions we couldn't answer. Why were there no animals around anymore? Why did the forest seem so quiet? Why did we keep looking toward the trees? We gave them reassuring non-answers, but I could see in their eyes that they weren't convinced. Children know when adults are frightened, even when those adults refuse to acknowledge their fear. Probably around midweek, we had just finished dinner and were getting the kids ready for bed, a task that's always easier said than done with young children. The evening routine had become more important than ever, a way to impose structure and normalcy on what increasingly felt like an abnormal situation. We were trying to maintain the illusion that everything was fine, that our unease was merely imagination. My daughter was her usual spirited self, and we were struggling to get her to settle down for the night. She discovered that the guest room's hardwood floors were perfect for sliding in stocking feet, and she kept escaping from bed to demonstrate this newfound skill. Her giggles filled the cabin, a delightful sound that should have brought joy but instead seemed to echo too loudly in the unnatural silence outside. The cabin has 2 bedrooms, and we were in the master when the incident occurred. The kids were supposed to be in the guest room, which has 2 beds positioned near large windows that offer views of both the lake and the forest. These windows had always been one of the room's best features, providing natural light during the day and stunning views of stars at night. We always left them open during our stays, enjoying the fresh mountain air and the gentle sounds of nature. That night, those same windows would become something else entirely. Portals through which terror could reach into our supposed sanctuary and shatter our sense of security forever. My son was in the kitchen getting a drink of water, a typical stalling tactic that we usually indulged because staying hydrated was important, especially in the dry mountain air. My daughter had just scampered away from me, giggling uncontrollably as I tried once again to tuck her into bed. Her energy seemed inexhaustible, fueled by the excitement of being at the cabin and the natural restlessness that comes with disrupted routines. The windows in the guest room were open, letting in the cooling evening air that carried the scent of pine needles and the distant smell of wood smoke from someone's fireplace. It was a perfect autumn night, crisp and clear, with stars beginning to emerge in the darkening sky. Everything felt normal, even peaceful, despite our growing unease over the past few days. Then suddenly, I heard my daughter's voice say, "Daddy," but it came from outside the window. The sound froze me in place. The voice was unmistakably hers. Same pitch, same inflection, same slight lisp that made her pronunciation of certain words so endearing. But there was something fundamentally wrong with it. The voice sounded distorted and electronic, as if it had come from a small speaker rather than from my daughter's throat. It carried an artificial quality that made my skin crawl, like a recording that had been played back through damaged equipment. Instantly, my body grew cold with a terror I'd never experienced before. This wasn't the manageable fear you feel during a scary movie, or the brief startle of an unexpected noise. This was something primal, a recognition at the cellular level that I was confronting something that shouldn't exist, something that violated the basic rules of reality I'd always taken for granted. The backyard outside those windows extends about 15 feet before turning into a wooded area, dense forest that stretches for miles without interruption. There was absolutely no way my daughter could have reached that spot outside in the brief time since she'd scampered away from me. The logistics were impossible. She would have had to leave the room, navigate through the cabin, exit through the front or back door, and circle around to the back of the building, all while I was standing in the very room where I'd just seen her. More disturbing than the impossibility was the implications. Someone or something in those woods had heard my daughter's voice and was capable of reproducing it with unnerving accuracy. The electronic distortion suggested technology. But what kind of person would use such equipment to terrorize a family? And why would they choose to imitate a child's voice? The possibilities that flooded my mind were uniformly horrifying. I rushed out of the bedroom, my heart hammering against my ribs as I moved as quickly as I could without alarming my family. I found my wife and children in the kitchen exactly where they should be. My son finishing his water, my daughter still giggling about her bedtime antics, completely unaware that her voice had just called to me from the darkness outside our temporary home. Seeing them safe should have provided relief, but instead, it intensified my terror. If my daughter was here, safe in the kitchen, then what had called my name from the forest? What was still out there, watching us, studying us, learning our voices and our routines? The questions multiplied in my mind like a virus, each one spawning new fears and darker possibilities. The night proceeded without further incident, but tension had replaced tranquility. Every sound from outside, the rustle of wind through leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, the creak of tree branches, made me freeze and listen intently. I found myself checking and rechecking the locks on doors and windows, despite knowing that locks would provide little protection against whatever had demonstrated the ability to perfectly mimic my daughter's voice. I didn't share the experience with my wife until we were back home, safe in our own house, surrounded by neighbors and streetlights and all the comforting signs of civilization. When I finally told her what had happened, she grew as concerned as I was. She admitted that she'd felt increasingly uneasy during those last few days at the cabin, sensing that something was watching our family from the forest surrounding the property. We discussed possible explanations, each one more unsettling than the last. Could it have been another person, someone with sophisticated audio equipment and malicious intentions? Could it have been some kind of natural phenomenon we didn't understand? Could our isolation have made us more susceptible to auditory hallucinations? None of these theories felt adequate to explain what I'd experienced. Life has since moved on in ways that feel almost surreal given what happened that night. We've had 3 more children and are thriving in our careers. We've even bought a house, a beautiful home in a suburban neighborhood where we know our neighbors and where strange sounds in the night can be easily explained. It's been years since we visited that cabin with just our immediate family, though we still attend family gatherings there occasionally. When we do return for these events, everything seems normal on the surface. My parents show no signs of having experienced anything unusual. Other family members comment on the cabin's beauty and peaceful atmosphere. Children play in the same guest room where I heard that impossible voice, sleeping soundly through nights that no longer seem to hold terror for anyone but me. However, the memory of that voice still haunts me with an intensity that hasn't diminished over time. Even now, years later, it sends the same icy shock of recognition through my system. I've learned to be wary of what exists in the spaces between our understanding and the natural world. The forest around that cabin taught me that there are things that lurk just beyond our perception. Things that watch and learn and sometimes reveal themselves in ways that fundamentally change how we see reality. You never know what might be waiting in the darkness. Studying your family, learning your voices, preparing for reasons we may never understand. The wilderness keeps its secrets, but sometimes those secrets decide to make themselves known. And when they do, the comfortable assumptions that govern our daily lives crumble like dried leaves beneath unseen feet, leaving us to wonder what else might be watching from shadows we've always taken for granted. It was mid to late August 2016 when we finalized the purchase of what I believed would be our sanctuary, a 1.5-story log cabin nestled against the imposing darkness of the Uchita National Forest. The property stretched across 15 densely wooded acres, punctuated by 2 murky ponds that reflected the canopy above like black mirrors, and bisected by a wet weather creek that gurgled with an almost whispered warning. The drive to view the property had been mesmerizing in the most unsettling way. Winding mountain highways carved through an endless expanse of trees, their branches so thick they blocked out most of the afternoon sun, casting everything in a perpetual twilight. What struck me as beautiful then, that rolling ocean of green stretching to every horizon, would later feel like a suffocating blanket hiding unknown terrors. The roads had no shoulders, just sheer drops into rocky ravines where twisted trees grew from impossible angles, their roots clutching at stone like desperate fingers. The air did feel different here, thinner somehow, as if the forest itself was breathing differently than the civilized world we'd left behind. There was an ancient quality to the silence between the sounds of our car engine, a silence that seemed to listen and wait. My 8-year-old son, Tommy, had been excited during the drive, pressing his face against the window and pointing out every deer and bird he spotted. His enthusiasm was infectious then, but now I wonder if children can sense things that adults have learned to ignore. He grew quieter as we drove deeper into the mountains, eventually falling asleep with his head pressed against the cool glass. When we signed the papers and received the keys, I felt a surge of pride and accomplishment. This was our fresh start, our escape from suburban monotony. The real estate agent, a weathered local woman named Mrs. Henderson, had given us a peculiar look when we mentioned we'd be moving in immediately. "You folks might want to wait until morning," she'd said, glancing at the lengthening shadows. "These mountains can be unsettling to newcomers at night." I dismissed her concern with a laugh, attributing it to small-town superstition. Now as I write this, her words echo with prophetic weight. After signing the papers, Tommy and I immediately began the process of moving our belongings from the truck to the cabin. The structure itself was beautiful in daylight. Solid logs chinked with white mortar, a wraparound porch that creaked pleasantly under our feet, and large windows that promised spectacular views of our new domain. The interior smelled of pine and old wood, with the faint mustiness that comes with a house that had stood empty for months. The living room dominated the ground floor, with a stone fireplace that looked capable of heating the entire space. Upstairs, the master bedroom overlooked the back of the property, where the forest pressed close enough that branches scraped against the windows when the wind picked up. What I'd seen as quaint during the daylight viewing now seemed ominous as evening approached. We'd arranged for my father to join us the following day, so that first night would be just Tommy and me breaking in our new home. I'd brought an air mattress for the master bedroom, and left the old owner's furniture, including a massive quilted hammock in the living room, in place until we could arrange our own. As darkness crept across the property, the forest transformed. What had been welcoming green spaces between trees became impenetrable black voids. The cheerful babbling of the creek took on a more urgent tone, and the settling sounds of the old cabin seemed to echo longer than they should have. Every window became a potential portal for unseen eyes to peer in, and I found myself unconsciously checking the locks more frequently than necessary. Tommy seemed oblivious to my growing unease, exploring every corner of the cabin with the fearless curiosity of childhood. He claimed the smaller upstairs room as his future bedroom, though for that first night, he'd be sharing the master bedroom with me on the air mattress. "Dad," he said as we prepared for bed, "why is it so quiet here?" His question struck me as odd. It wasn't quiet at all. The forest was alive with sounds. Insects chirped and buzzed. Leaves rustled constantly, and somewhere in the distance an owl called mournfully. But I understood what he meant. It was the absence of human sounds. No traffic, no neighbors' televisions, no distant sirens or airplanes. Just the organic symphony of the wilderness, which somehow felt more threatening than comforting as night fell completely. We hadn't been lying on the air mattress for more than 20 minutes when the first unusual sound reached us through the bedroom windows. It wasn't the expected hooting of an owl, or the rustle of small animals moving through the underbrush. This was something else entirely, a deep resonant woot sound that seemed to come from multiple directions at once. The vocalizations came in sets of 3, each one distinct and purposeful. They had an almost conversational quality, as if different entities were responding to each other across the darkness. The sounds were too loud and too deep to be any bird I knew, and they carried an intelligence that made the hair on my arms stand up. Tommy stirred beside me but didn't wake, his breathing still steady and peaceful. I lay perfectly still, straining to identify the source of these calls. They seemed to circle the property, sometimes closer, sometimes farther away, but always maintaining that eerie pattern of 3. Between the vocalizations, I began to notice other sounds, subtle at first, but growing more distinct as my ears adjusted to the forest's rhythm. A soft pattering began against the sliding glass doors that led to the back deck. At first, I assumed it was insects drawn to whatever light filtered through the curtains, but the sound was too irregular, too forceful. I eased out of bed, careful not to wake Tommy, and crept to the window. Peering through a gap in the curtains, I could barely make out the deck in the faint starlight. Small objects were striking the glass and bouncing off. Not insects, but twigs, pebbles, and what looked like acorns. They seemed to be coming from the tree line, thrown with enough force to make audible impacts against the sturdy glass doors. The throwing continued for several minutes. Not random, but purposeful, as if testing the barriers of our shelter. I found myself counting the impacts, noting how they seemed to come in patterns. 3 hits, pause, 3 more hits, pause, the same pattern as the vocal calls. My rational mind searched for explanations. Perhaps squirrels were dropping nuts from the trees above the deck. Maybe the wind was picking up small debris and hurling it against the cabin. But even as I formed these thoughts, I knew they were inadequate. The timing was too precise, the pattern too deliberate. Then came the sounds from the forest itself. Heavy footsteps that made no attempt at stealth. The sharp crack of substantial branches breaking under significant weight. And the rustle of leaves being disturbed by something much larger than any deer or bear I'd ever encountered. These weren't the careful movements of wildlife trying to avoid detection. These were the sounds of something moving through the forest with confidence and purpose. Something that had no fear of being heard. The sounds from the forest grew progressively bolder and more aggressive. What had started as mysterious calls and thrown debris escalated into something that felt distinctly hostile. The heavy footsteps were now accompanied by what sounded like massive stones being hurled against trees or pounded into the ground with tremendous force. Each impact sent a vibration through the forest floor that I could feel even through the cabin's foundation. Then came the knocking. This wasn't the random percussion of woodpeckers, or the settling of old wood. This was the unmistakable sound of wood striking wood with deliberate rhythm and tremendous force. The impacts were so powerful, they seemed to shake the trees themselves, sending echoes rolling across the property like thunder. 3 knocks, pause, 3 more knocks, pause. The pattern was becoming disturbingly familiar. I found myself thinking of every horror story I'd ever dismissed. Every campfire tale I'd laughed off as superstition. The knocking continued, sometimes from different directions, as if multiple entities were communicating across the darkness using the trees as drums. The sound was primal and purposeful, carrying an unmistakable message. We were not alone, and our presence had been noted. Around 11:30 am, the sky opened up with a torrential downpour that hammered against the cabin's roof like artillery fire. The rain was so intense it drowned out all other sounds, creating a wall of white noise that was almost comforting after the unnerving symphony from the forest. I hoped desperately that whatever was out there would seek shelter and leave us in peace. But my relief was short-lived. As the rain began to subside, the sounds resumed with renewed intensity. The knocking was closer now, coming from the trees directly behind the cabin, just beyond the back deck. Something was moving through the storm-soaked forest with apparent ease, undeterred by the weather that had sent every other creature seeking shelter. The footsteps were different now, heavier, more purposeful, accompanied by the sound of large branches being snapped like twigs. Whatever was making these sounds was demonstrating a strength that went far beyond any animal I could imagine. The very earth seemed to tremble with each footfall. Then came the moment that shattered my last hope of rational explanation. A tremendous impact struck the cabin wall directly below our bedroom, so forceful that the entire structure shuddered and groaned. The sound was like a boulder being hurled against the logs, or an enormous fist pounding against the walls with rage. The force was so great that pictures rattled on the walls and the air mattress bounced beneath us. Tommy jolted awake with a cry of terror, his eyes wide and searching in the darkness. "What was that?" he whispered, his voice small and frightened. I could hear the tremor in his words, could feel his small body shaking beside me. My protective instincts kicked in, overriding my own fear. I scooped him up and carried him quickly to the smaller upstairs room. The office space that felt somehow safer simply because it didn't have the large sliding glass doors that suddenly seemed so vulnerable. The regular bedroom windows seemed like a fortress compared to those expansive glass panels that offered such an unobstructed view into our temporary refuge. My hands shook as I fumbled for the light switches, flooding the exterior of the cabin with harsh artificial illumination. The front porch light, back deck light, and every outdoor fixture I could control blazed to life, pushing back the darkness that had concealed our tormentors. The sudden shift from pitch black to glaring brightness felt like donning armor. Tommy huddled close to me in the office, his eyes wide with questions I couldn't answer. The fear in his young face broke my heart, but it also fueled a protective anger that overcame my terror. Whatever was out there threatening my son would face the full fury of a father's wrath. I moved to the office window, the one that overlooked the front of the property, and cranked it open just wide enough to project my voice. The night air that rushed in was surprisingly cool and carried scents of wet earth, pine needles, and something else, something musky and wild that I couldn't identify. "Leave us alone," I shouted into the darkness beyond the light's reach. My voice echoed off the trees and seemed to be swallowed by the forest. "We're trying to sleep." The words felt inadequate, almost absurdly civilized given the circumstances, but they represented my desperate attempt to establish some form of communication with whatever intelligence lurked in the shadows. For several long minutes, the forest fell into complete silence. Even the normal night sounds, the insects and small animals, seemed to have been shocked into stillness by my outburst. It was as if the entire wilderness was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Tommy pressed against my side, whispering, "Dad, what's out there?" I couldn't bring myself to voice the thoughts racing through my mind. How could I tell my 8-year-old son that I suspected we were dealing with something that challenged everything I thought I knew about the natural world? How could I explain that the stories I'd always dismissed as folklore might be rooted in terrifying reality? The silence stretched on, broken only by the steady drip of water from the rain-soaked trees. I began to hope that whatever had been harassing us had finally withdrawn, driven back by the lights and my vocal challenge. Perhaps confrontation was the key. Perhaps these entities, whatever they were, respected bold resistance. But that hope was premature. Around 4:30 a.m., just as I was beginning to relax, the sounds resumed with a vengeance. The tree knocking was more aggressive than before, closer to the cabin, and accompanied by what sounded like enormous branches being torn from their trunks and hurled to the ground. The message was clear. Our defiance had not gone unnoticed, and it had not been appreciated. My father's voice drifted up from downstairs, groggy and confused. The hammock creaked as he struggled to consciousness, awakened by the latest round of forest percussion. His presence was both a comfort and a concern. Comfort because I was no longer the only adult witness to these events, but concern because now there was another person to protect. "What in God's name is going on up there?" he called, his voice thick with sleep but tinged with growing alarm as the sounds from outside registered fully in his awakening mind. The first light of dawn crept through the office windows like a cautious animal, revealing a world transformed by the night's events. What had been familiar and welcoming in daylight now seemed alien and potentially hostile. The trees that had provided such beautiful scenery now loomed like watchtowers, their branches reaching toward the cabin like grasping fingers. My father appeared in the doorway, his gray hair disheveled and his face creased with concern and confusion. "Son, what happened here last night?" he asked, taking in the sight of Tommy and me huddled together in the small office, both of us exhausted and wide-eyed from our sleepless vigil. I explained everything as best I could. The calls, the thrown objects, the tree knocking, and especially the tremendous impact against the cabin wall. Dad listened with the patient attention he'd always given to my childhood stories, but I could see the skepticism growing in his eyes. In the growing daylight, my account sounded fantastical even to me. "Well," he said finally, "let's go have a look around. If something was out there making all that noise, there ought to be some evidence." Tommy wanted to come with us, but I insisted he stay inside where it was safe. The boy had been through enough for one night. Dad and I armed ourselves with flashlights, though the dawn light was growing stronger by the minute, and stepped out onto the wraparound porch. The morning air was crisp and clean, washed fresh by the previous night's rain. Birds were beginning their dawn chorus, and somewhere in the distance, a rooster crowed from a neighboring property. The normalcy of these sounds felt almost surreal after the night we'd endured. We began our investigation methodically, walking the perimeter of the cabin and examining the ground for signs of disturbance. I was surprised by how little obvious evidence we found initially. The forest floor was carpeted with fallen leaves that had been further scattered by the rain, making it difficult to identify specific tracks or impressions. Dad moved with the careful attention of someone who'd spent years hunting and tracking. He examined broken branches, studied scuff marks on trees, and knelt frequently to inspect areas of disturbed earth. His hunting experience gave him an eye for details that I would never have noticed. Near the back of the cabin, where the most aggressive knocking had originated. We found our first clear evidence. A substantial oak tree, easily 8 inches in diameter, showed fresh damage to its trunk. The bark was stripped away in irregular patches, revealing the pale wood beneath, and there were deep gouges that looked like they'd been made by something with tremendous strength and sharp implements. "This is fresh," Dad muttered, running his fingers along the damaged bark. "Something did this last night." He looked up at the tree's canopy, noting several large branches that appeared to have been twisted and broken. Whatever did this had to be incredibly strong. I've never seen damage like this from any animal I know, but it was Dad who made the discovery that would haunt us both for years to come. Near the stone walkway that led to our covered porch, Dad called out in a voice tight with shock, "Son, you need to come see this." I hurried over to where he was kneeling beside the path, brushing wet leaves away from what appeared to be impressions in the soft earth. The rain had turned the soil into perfect casting material, preserving details with startling clarity. What he'd uncovered made my stomach clench with a mixture of vindication and terror. 3 large footprints were pressed deep into the mud, each one clearly defined despite the night's downpour. They were unmistakably humanoid, but far larger than any human foot should be, easily 17 inches long and proportionally wide. The depth of the impression suggested incredible weight, far beyond what any normal person could produce. But it was the details that made these prints truly unsettling. The toes were clearly defined, showing no sign of claws or the thick pads of a bear's paw. These were feet, recognizably human in structure but impossibly large. The big toe was positioned like a human thumb, and there were clear impression marks from the heel and arch that spoke of bipedal locomotion. "Jesus," Dad whispered, then caught himself. "I mean, dear God, look at the size of these things." Beside the massive footprints, partially obscured by a fallen branch, was something even more disturbing, a handprint pressed into the soft earth near the edge of the walkway. This print was smaller, more proportional to what might be expected from a juvenile, but it showed the same impossible characteristics. The fingers were long and clearly defined, with what appeared to be an opposable thumb, but the palm was far too large for any human child. Dad stood slowly, his face pale in the growing daylight. "I've been hunting these mountains for 30 years, he said quietly. "I've seen bear tracks, deer tracks, every kind of animal print you can imagine. These aren't from any animal I know." We followed the tracks as far as we could, noting how they approached the cabin from multiple directions. The prints suggested that at least 3 large entities had been moving around our property during the night, apparently observing us, testing our defenses, and ultimately challenging our presence. The stone walkway itself showed signs of having been examined closely. Several of the larger stones had been moved slightly, as if something had been testing their weight and stability. Muddy fingerprint-like marks on some of the stones suggested that whatever had made the tracks possessed not just incredible size and strength, but also a curious intelligence. "Dad," I said quietly, staring down at the evidence before us, "what do you think we're dealing with here?" He was quiet for a long moment, studying the prints and the damaged tree, before answering with characteristic honesty, "Son, yesterday I would have said black bear without hesitation. Bears can rear up on their hind legs. They're strong enough to damage trees, and they can be territorial about new residents in their area." He paused, kneeling again to examine the largest footprint more closely. "But bears don't make prints like these, and they don't organize coordinated harassment campaigns against human dwellings. Whatever made these tracks was intelligent, organized, and..." He trailed off, unwilling to voice the conclusion that was becoming increasingly unavoidable. As we stood there in the growing daylight, surrounded by evidence of our nocturnal visitors, I found myself reassessing everything I thought I knew about the world. The skeptical, rational part of my mind still searched for conventional explanations, elaborate hoaxes, misidentified animals, some combination of natural phenomena that could account for what we'd experienced. But the evidence was undeniable. The massive footprints, the damaged tree, the coordinated nature of the harassment, and most convincingly, the memory of that tremendous impact against the cabin wall that had shaken the entire structure. No conventional explanation could account for all of these elements. Tommy appeared at the cabin's back door, having grown tired of waiting inside. His young eyes immediately fixed on the footprints, and his face went pale. "Dad, what made those?" I looked at my father, searching for guidance. How do you explain to a child that the monsters from bedtime stories might be real? How do you balance honesty with the need to provide comfort and security? Dad knelt down to Tommy's level, his weathered hands gentle on the boy's shoulders. Son, it looks like we've moved into a neighborhood that already has some pretty big residents. We're going to have to learn how to be good neighbors. It was a diplomatic answer that acknowledged the reality without adding to the child's fears. Tommy studied the prints with the fearless curiosity of youth, asking practical questions about size and depth that helped normalize what we were seeing. As the morning progressed and we completed our examination of the property, several things became clear. First, whatever had visited us during the night possessed intelligence and organization that went far beyond simple animal behavior. The coordinated timing of the calls, the systematic testing of our defenses, and the escalating nature of the harassment all suggested planning and purpose. Second, these entities were not merely passing through our property but seemed to consider it part of their established territory. The thorough nature of their investigation, the multiple approach routes evidenced by the tracks, and the bold proximity of their activities all suggested familiarity with the area. Most unsettling of all was the realization that our arrival had clearly been observed and evaluated. The sequence of events from the initial calls that seemed to announce our presence, to the testing phase with thrown objects, to the aggressive tree knocking and finally the direct assault on the cabin itself, felt like a deliberate escalation designed to gauge our reactions and determine our threat level. Looking back now, I believe that first night was our introduction to a community we didn't know existed. The initial calls might indeed have been announcements or even greetings, attempts at communication by intelligences that operated by rules we couldn't understand. Our fear and defensiveness, culminating in my shouted challenge from the window, may have been interpreted as hostility. The damage to the tree and the bold approach to our cabin represented a clear message in return. We were outnumbered, outmatched, and under observation. The cessation of activities after my vocal confrontation suggested not retreat, but rather a decision that enough had been communicated for one evening. Standing there in the August morning light, studying the evidence of our encounter, I realized that moving to this beautiful, isolated property had involved more than just a change of address. We had relocated to a frontier where the boundaries between the known and unknown were fluid, where ancient intelligences might still roam the deep forests, and where the price of our mountain paradise might be an acknowledgement that we were no longer alone. As I write this account, months after that first terrifying night, I find myself wondering about the true nature of our neighbors in the Ouachita Mountains. Were they the creatures of legend and folklore, beings that had learned to remain hidden while humanity spread across their ancient territories? Were we dealing with an unknown species that had developed intelligence and social organization beyond our current understanding? The questions remain unanswered, but the evidence remains undeniable. In the deep forests of Arkansas, something watches and waits, something intelligent enough to organize, strong enough to damage trees and shake buildings, and bold enough to approach human dwellings under cover of darkness. We still live in the cabin, though we've made certain modifications to our security and have learned to show proper respect for our unseen neighbors. The encounters continue occasionally, but they've taken on a different character, less aggressive, more observational. Perhaps we've reached an understanding of sorts, an acknowledgement of mutual territory and cautious coexistence. But on quiet nights when the wind moves through the trees and the forest settles into its ancient rhythms, I sometimes hear those deep, purposeful calls echoing across the darkness. And I know that we are still being watched, still being evaluated by intelligences that knew these mountains long before humans ever walked upright. The Ouachita National Forest keeps its secrets well, but for those willing to listen, it occasionally shares glimpses of wonders and terrors that challenge everything we think we know about the natural world. We are not alone in these mountains, and perhaps we never were. My name is Edward Johnson, and I am 66 years old. This is the story of an event that changed my life forever. An encounter that took place in October 2011, in a place I thought I knew like the back of my hand, the Redwood National and State Parks in California. For 8 years, I worked as a ranger in those majestic forests. Some called me a park veteran, and the job had gotten into my blood. The crisp air, the towering trees, the sound of the creek. It was my kind of paradise. I wasn't about to quit anytime soon. That fateful day started like any other. I laced up my boots, grabbed my gear, and headed out for my usual patrol route. It was a clear autumn morning, the first leaves starting to paint the forest floor in golds and reds. But something felt off. The forest, usually alive with bird song and the chattering of small creatures, was unnervingly quiet. As I hiked deeper into the woods, an unsettling feeling crept over me. It was as if something was watching me, following my every move. The sensation only intensified as the day wore on. Then I saw it, a sight so bizarre that my mind struggled to process it. A deer carcass, torn open and half devoured, hung from the branches of a tree at a height no predator I knew could reach. As I approached to examine it, a wave of nausea washed over me. The slashes and tears on the animal looked surgical, calculated, as if something methodical had done this. "What the hell are you?" I muttered under my breath, scanning the surrounding trees. My heart pounded in my chest as I spotted a flicker of movement, then a pair of glowing eyes staring down at me. They looked almost human, but far too large. What confronted me from the treetops was massive, far bigger than any human, with impossibly long, thin limbs. Its skin was dark, textured like rough bark. The thing tilted its head at an unnatural angle, and then in a blink, it was gone, vanished into the canopy. Panicked, I radioed for backup, stammering out a bewildered description of the creature. Ranger Dispatch sounded amused, probably thinking I'd finally cracked under the strain of the job. But then I heard my partner Alara shouting over the radio. She was further down the trail, her voice panicked. "Killian, I found something. You need to get here fast. It's bad, really bad." A sickening dread pooled in my stomach as I raced to her location. What I saw made me question my own sanity. A hiker lay sprawled on the ground, his body torn and twisted at impossible angles. There were the same methodical marks on him that I'd seen on the deer, a kind of calculated brutality that made me want to retch. Before I could process the horror of this scene, a scream tore through the trees. I bolted after the sound, Elara trailing behind. Branches whipped at my face and roots snagged at my feet, but fear propelled me forward. When I reached a clearing, my blood turned to ice. Elara was trapped. The creature had her pinned to the ground. One massive hand clamped over her mouth. Its other hand hovered inches from her throat, long claws glinting in the dappled sunlight. Its eyes burned with an intelligence that was both eerie and terrifying. We locked eyes, and for a frozen moment, I swear it paused, as though trying to read my intentions. Then, with a speed that defied its size, it grabbed Alara and vanished back into the dense foliage. I collapsed to my knees, a strangled sob escaping my throat. My mind raced. Was this some kind of freak of nature? An undiscovered species? Or something else? Something far more sinister? I knew no animal, no person could have done this. The woods that were once my sanctuary had become a nightmare, and whatever lurked in those trees had broken something fundamental inside me. When backup finally arrived, I looked like a madman, babbling about monsters and eyes in the trees. They sedated me, and when I woke up, they were chalking it up to stress, maybe even a bear attack. Despite extensive searches, no trace of Alara or the creature was ever recovered, leaving an open wound in our tight-knit ranger community. I resigned from my position a few weeks later. I tried to explain what I saw, but my words sounded hollow even to my own ears. The incident haunted me, the carnage, Alara's terrified eyes, the creature's unnatural intelligence. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't just prey in this equation. I was being studied. The experience tore me from the wilderness I once loved, and left me with an unshakable fear that lingers to this day. I tell this story now, not for sympathy or to seek validation. Frankly, I don't expect anyone to believe me, but I can no longer stay silent. Something inhuman dwells in those woods, and it will strike again. It's only a matter of time. In the decade that followed, I couldn't settle. I moved constantly, from one anonymous city to the next, the paranoia gnawing at me like a persistent hunger. I tried therapy, support groups, even medication. Nothing could banish the chilling memory of those glowing eyes and the feeling of being watched. I became a shadow of myself, a husk driven by a constant irrational dread. Then the reports began. At first it was just whispers, hushed rumors among park rangers in Oregon and Washington, disappearances, animal mutilations bearing the same methodical marks I'd seen years earlier. My heart pounded in my chest. It was back. No one connected the dots except for me. These incidents were treated as separate tragedies, freak accidents. I knew better. I felt sick with guilt and helplessness. Desperate, I tried to warn others. But it only fueled the perception that I was unhinged. My frantic stories about the creature only confirmed what everyone already suspected. The ordeal in the woods had shattered me. No one listened, and more lives were lost. I became an outcast and a cautionary tale. One night, an old colleague, Simon, reached out. I hadn't spoken to him since the Redwood incident. His voice on the phone was grim. "Killian, people are dying out here. Rangers, hikers, it's like you said, you need to come back." With heavy reluctance, I found myself on a backcountry trail in Washington's Olympic National Park. The air carried the same damp smell of earth and pine needles that filled my nightmares. Simon, visibly shaken, filled me in. Over the previous weeks, 3 hikers had vanished, and 2 rangers were found brutally murdered, bearing the familiar terrifying wounds. The hunt began. We moved through the ancient forest, our senses on high alert. Simon knew I hadn't made up what I saw. My insistence, my unwavering fear, had slowly swayed him to the terrible truth. We were days deep into the wilderness, the dread hanging heavier with each passing night. Then came the sighting. It flickered across the trail, a hulking silhouette moving against the moonlight. We exchanged a terrified glance and took off in pursuit. The creature was fast, impossibly fast, its long limbs propelling it through the dense undergrowth at unnatural speeds. Twigs snapped and leaves rustled, but it was eerily silent. It led us deeper into the forest, into an area even Simon had never ventured into. Finally, we emerged into a hidden clearing, dimly lit by the moon. In the center of the clearing stood a tree far more massive than any I'd ever seen. At its base were remnants, clothing, backpacks, bones, all stained with dark, dried blood. The sight turned my stomach. This was its lair, a gruesome trophy case. A low growl broke the silence, and the creature stepped out from the shadows. This time I saw it clearly, all 7 feet of it. The impossibly long claws, the dark leathery skin, but it was the eyes that chilled me to the bone. Glowing pools of malevolence. Fear and fury surged within me. A desperate need to avenge Alara, those who died, and the shattered remains of my own life. I raised my rifle, my hands shaking. Simon squeezed my shoulder, and with a grim nod he drew his own weapon. Shots rang out, echoing through the clearing. The creature let out a guttural roar, but it didn't falter. It charged, its movements a blur of limbs and claws. We fired again and again, the desperation giving us an edge. I swore I saw the creature stumble, but it didn't fall. Suddenly, Simon screamed. He was on the ground, one massive hand wrapped around his leg, dragging him relentlessly toward the massive tree. I sprinted to his side, but the creature moved with blinding speed. With a sickening crunch, it snapped Simon's leg like a brittle branch, and his horrified screams cut through the night. I was next. A giant hand closed around my torso, lifting me off the ground, and the gun clattered uselessly away. Its rancid breath washed over me as I stared into its fathomless eyes, and the last thing I saw was the unnatural bend of its arm as it brought one impossibly long claw closer. Then, darkness. The aftermath is a blur. I woke up in a hospital bed, battered, bandaged, but alive. The official report called it an encounter with a rogue bear, but the disbelieving look in the doctor's eyes suggested he knew better. The story made headlines, stirring the same fascination and doubt that followed me from Redwood. I never went back to the woods. Instead, I exist in the purgatory of populated spaces. The cities and crowds I once avoided. Sometimes in the dead of night, I wake in a cold sweat and see the creature, its glowing eyes boring into my soul. I know in those moments that I haven't escaped it. Not really. It's still out there, a patient hunter waiting for the next opportunity, the next victim, and I'm powerless to stop it. The late afternoon sun filtered through the towering pines as I hiked the winding trail deep into the remote back country of the national forest. Sweat trickled down my brow and my pack felt heavy on my shoulders, but after 6 years as a park ranger, I was used to long treks into the wilderness. This time was different though. I was heading out alone to investigate reports of strange occurrences at a remote campsite. As an experienced ranger who had worked everywhere from the dense forests of Oregon to the rolling hills of Pennsylvania, I thought I had seen it all. But the panicked, rambling accounts from the few hikers who had stumbled out of this isolated region had chilled me to the bone. Tales of eerie howls echoing through the night, tents ripped to shreds, and campers vanishing without a trace. The higher-ups wanted answers, so they sent me out to see what I could find. A strange silence hung over the forest as I approached the campsite nestled in a small clearing. No birdsong, no skittering of small animals in the underbrush. Even the wind seemed to still, letting an oppressive quiet settle over the area like a heavy blanket. A shiver ran down my spine despite the warm early fall air. Something felt wrong. Reaching the camp, my heart nearly stopped. It was in shambles, like a bomb had gone off. Tents were torn to ribbons, their tattered remains fluttering in the faint breeze. Coolers and backpacks were strewn about haphazardly, their contents scattered across the forest floor. But worst of all were the dark stains splashed across the shredded nylon and soaked into the pine needles. Blood. A lot of it. Swallowing hard, I set my pack down and began to investigate the scene with a growing sense of unease. No bodies, just the wreckage left behind. What the hell had happened here? As I gingerly picked through the destroyed supplies, a glint of color caught my eye from beneath a torn sleeping bag. Pulling it free, my stomach clenched. It was a little girl's stuffed bunny, the pink fabric marred by 4 jagged slashes, like claw marks. A piercing howl suddenly cut through the unnatural silence, sending icy tendrils of fear down my spine. It was unlike anything I had ever heard before. Neither wolf nor coyote. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as I reached for the rifle slung over my shoulder. The sun dipped below the tree line, shadows pooling beneath the pines. The stuffed bunny tumbled from my shaking hands. What had I gotten myself into? The authorities were little help when I hiked back out to report my unsettling findings. They wanted to write it off as a bear attack, or maybe the work of some deranged vagabond. But I knew better. This was something else, something unnatural. Desperate for answers, I began to dig into the history of the area, scouring old newspapers and historical society records for any similar incidents in the past. What I found sent chills down my spine. I wasn't the first to encounter the strange terrors in those woods. For centuries, sporadic accounts emerged of hikers disappearing, of horrifically mutilated wildlife and livestock being discovered by hapless farmers and lumberjacks. Most disturbing of all were the reports from loggers in the early 1900s of mysterious creatures glimpsed moving through the forest, vaguely human in shape, but distorted. Wrong. The same stories surfaced again and again over the decades before fading into obscurity. Until now. With a heavy sense of foreboding, I sat down with a wizened elder from the local Native American tribe. His deeply lined face grew even more somber as I described the scene at the campsite. The Wendigo, he whispered in a voice papery with age. Those who walk like them, the spirits of the lost who consume the flesh of the living. They have stalked these lands since before my people's time. I listened in mute horror as he recounted the grisly tales passed down for generations, of unwise hunters pursuing a strange pale deer deep into the forest, only to fall victim to the Wendigo's insatiable hunger. Of the mad homeless men who wandered out from the trees, raving about the Wendigo's icy touch before succumbing to frostbite in the middle of summer. The elder fixed me with a sad, knowing gaze. "The Wendigo is a thing of pure evil," he said gravely. "Many have faced it over the long centuries. None have defeated it. You must be careful, Ranger, or you will join those who walk like them." Driving home that night, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched from the impenetrable tree line, of cold, inhuman eyes tracking my every move. Wendigo. The name echoed in my head. Just old myths and legends, I tried to assure myself. But deep down, I wasn't so sure. Against my better judgment, I ventured back out into the wilderness the following week, determined to uncover the truth behind the strange events. But from the moment I stepped under the shadow of the pines, an inexplicable primal terror crept over me. I knew these woods, knew them like the back of my hand after years of patrols and rescues, but now an alien quality permeated the once familiar landscape. The birdsong was still eerily absent, the underbrush devoid of small creatures. Even the patterns of light and shadow felt different, unnatural, as if the forest itself had been corrupted by some malevolent force. My radio crackled and hissed with static. More the deeper I hiked, my GPS fritzing in and out as if strained by some unseen interference. A sudden flash of movement between the distant trees made me freeze, my heart pounding. There, again, a shadow darting against the normal play of light and shade. Bipedal, fast, but strangely elongated. Adrenaline flooded my veins even as my mind struggled to process the impossible. Crack! The sharp sound of snapping branches shattered the silence. Something large was moving through the undergrowth, and it was coming towards me. Fumbling with my rifle, I braced myself for whatever emerged, but nothing could have prepared me for the grisly sight I encountered around the curve of the trail ahead. Animal bodies, or rather parts of them, littered the forest floor in a wide swath of blood and gore. Deer, rabbits, foxes. It looked like a pack of frenzied wolves had torn through the area, but the pieces were too cleanly severed, the wounds too surgical. No ragged bites or gnaw marks, just glistening red and white bone. I barely had time to comprehend the horror before an agonized human scream pierced the air, followed by the sounds of snapping twigs and crunching leaves. Someone was running through the woods, full tilt, no, two people, from the overlapping footfalls and gasping breaths, running from something that snarled and roared with a voice straight from the depths of hell. Heart pounding, I crashed through the underbrush towards the terrified shrieks, heedless of the branches that tore at my skin and clothing. I had to find them, had to help them, before whatever had butchered those animals found them first. The trail emptied abruptly into a small valley, the rocky slopes rising sharply on either side. I stumbled to a stop, my breath catching in my throat. An enormous cave mouth yawned in the hillside ahead, jagged and black. Claw marks scoured the stone walls, far too large to be from any bear. Some towered over my head, left by something massive and strong enough to gouge solid rock. Movement near the cave made my head snap around. There, two figures staggered out from behind a boulder. A man and a woman, both in their 20s, wearing shredded, blood-stained hiking gear. They took one look at me and broke down, collapsing to their knees as sobs racked their bodies. I ran over, relief and dread warring within me. "It's okay, I've got you," I said, kneeling beside them. "What happened? What's out there?" The man shook his head frantically, his eyes wide and glassy with shock. "Didn't see." Nearby, his female companion rocked back and forth, hugging herself as she repeated the same words over and over in a thready whisper. Screaming, tore them apart, eating. A sudden awful realization clicked into place. Colder than ice. I followed the direction of her unfocused gaze to the leaf-strewn ground at the base of the hill. My stomach lurched. Rising from the dead leaves were human footprints, but they were wrong. The proportions subtly off. The toes too long, the ankle joints positioned at an impossible angle. No boot or shoe could leave marks like that. The tracks led towards the cave, then morphed halfway, the human proportions distorting, elongating, becoming something out of a nightmare. I swallowed hard against the bile rising in my throat. "We need to get out of here," I managed. Now. Darkness came early in the narrow valley, the sun's light blocked by the steep slopes long before true night fell. I built a small fire just outside the mouth of the cave, hoping the light would keep whatever horrors lurked in the forest at bay. The two hikers huddled as close to the flames as they could, still shaking, their eyes haunted. Trauma had rendered them nearly catatonic, able to answer only in monosyllables or garbled fragments. I sorted through my pack with unsteady hands, pulling out my satellite phone. No signal. Of course not. Forcing down my growing panic, I turned back to my charges. I'm going to hike up to the ridge, see if I can get reception to call for help. Stay here, stay by the fire. I'll be back as soon as I can. The man nodded distractedly, but the woman seized my arm in a desperate grip, her nails digging into my skin. "Don't," she whispered hoarsely. "Don't leave us. It's still out there." I covered her icy hand with my own, trying to offer what little comfort I could. "I have to get us help. I won't be gone long. I promise. Just stay in the light." Prying myself free, I slung my rifle over my shoulder and made for the hillside. Fear soured my stomach and competition engines roared in my ears as I picked my way up the rocky slope. All my instincts screamed to flee, to get as far away from this cursed place as I could. But I had a duty to the survivors. I couldn't abandon them to the darkness and the horrors it concealed. I was so focused on reaching the top, on the tiny bars of my phone's display, that I almost missed the flash of pale motion in the periphery of my vision. Something moving against the moonlight filtering through the pines below. Something fast and big. My head snapped up, my heart nearly stopping in my chest. A strangled gasp escaped my lips. There, on the opposite ridge, perched a monstrosity that shouldn't exist outside of demented nightmares. It looked like a man, but impossibly tall and emaciated, its elongated arms hanging to its knees, tattered flesh the color of a corpse, stretched tight over jutting ribs and atrophied muscles. But worst of all was its face, or lack thereof. Where features should have been, there was only a featureless expanse of taut grayish-white skin, like a mask pulled too tight. No mouth, no nose, but set deep in bruise-colored sockets. Two milky eyes rolled with frenetic madness, fixing on me with predatory focus. Pure primal terror, unlike anything I had ever known, slammed through my veins, rooting me to the spot. It saw me. It knew I had seen it. And even at this distance I could feel the waves of malevolence and hunger radiating from its twisted form. A high, keening wail shattered the night, issuing from everywhere and nowhere all at once. The creature threw its head back in a grotesque approximation of a howl, and then it moved, bounding down the hillside in long, stiff strides, its burning gaze never leaving me. By pure instinct, I brought my rifle to my shoulder and fired, the shots cracking deafeningly in the still air. The thing jerked and spasmed as the bullet struck, but it didn't fall. Thick black ooze dribbled from the wounds, splattering to the rocks below. My last rational thought before I turned to flee was that it wasn't bleeding. The dead don't bleed. I have no memory of the mad flight back down the ridge, of reaching the hikers and all but dragging them into the doubtful safety of the cave. All I remember is blind, unreasoning terror, a need to hide, to escape the icy gaze of the thing that pursued us. The darkness within the cave was absolute, impenetrable even to the thin beams of our flashlights. I pulled the survivors to the floor, heedless of the damp cold radiating up from the stone.
"Don't move," I hissed. "Don't make a sound."
We huddled together in the inky blackness, shaking uncontrollably as those stiff, uneven footsteps grew closer. Every scrape of rock, every unnatural hitch and pop of joints and bones brought fresh waves of horror crashing over me. I clamped a hand over my mouth, fighting the urge to scream, run, hide, outstretched arms and grasping fingers. It passed by the entrance with a soft rustle of air, the meaty stench of decay announcing its presence. I didn't dare breathe, silently begging every deity I could think of to let it keep moving, to not let it look within. But the footsteps paused, near the cave mouth, close enough to touch. An eternity passed in the darkness, marked only by the hammering of my heart. And then mercifully the footsteps resumed, receding into the night. It was gone. I exhaled shakily, tears of relief burning my eyes. But no one answered. Next to me, the hikers had gone limp, slumped bonelessly against the cave wall. Oh God, had they fainted? I fumbled for a flashlight with nerveless fingers. Hey, I gave them both a rough shake. We have to move. Come on. The flashlight clicked on, and the beam fell across the man's face, illuminating wide, sightless eyes and bloody froth oozing over blue lips. His throat had been torn out, vocal cords glistening wetly in the stark light. A scream ripped from my throat, echoing frantically off the stone walls. I scrambled backwards in blind panic, kicking out at the gory ruin that had been a human only moments before. The flashlight tumbled from my hands, rolling to a stop against something soft. Shaking, I snatched it back up, swinging the beam wildly. The woman hung upside down from the ceiling, suspended by something dark and ropey wrapped around her ankles. Her abdomen had been split open from groin to breastbone, putrid coils of intestine spilling out like obscene streamers. Black blood dripped steadily into a spreading pool on the cave floor. Numb horror gave way to realization, colder and sharper than a knife's blade. The thing had never left the cave. It had been here the whole time, watching, waiting, playing with us, and we had walked right into its trap. When the flashlight beam touched the far wall, my mind went blank, unable to process the obscenity splashed across the stone. Bones. Yellowed, snapped human bones, dozens of them dangling from hooks pounded into the rock. Interspersed with the bones were tattered backpacks, faded scraps of clothing, shattered pairs of glasses, all that remained of the Wendigo's countless victims. But worst of all was the smell. The thick, choking reek of rotted meat and fetid decay, of cold earth and the grave, permeating every molecule of air, the stench of centuries of slaughter. The light caught a flicker of movement, and I spun, the scream dying in my throat. There, in the shadows, a glimpse of pallid gray skin and malformed limbs, of sightless white eyes in sunken sockets, watching, waiting. More shapes shifted in the darkness behind it, skeletal and hungry. I was in their lair, their den, and they weren't going to let me leave. I ran. There was nothing else I could do. Turning, I fled towards the cave entrance, the flashlight beam bouncing wildly off the damp stone walls. Clawed hands swiped at my back, snagging in my shirt. I wrenched away, fabric tearing, stumbling over the uneven ground. They were right behind me. Stiff, elongated legs scissored on either side of me as I burst out of the cave into the night-shrouded forest. The cold air seared my lungs and my muscles screamed in protest. But I pushed myself harder, ducking and weaving between the pines. Have to get away, have to get away. A flicker in the periphery. A glimpse of something pale and emaciated keeping easy pace, toying with me. The knowledge sent a flood of pure panic straight to my limbs, terror overriding exhaustion. But I was only human. The trail curved sharply ahead, and I careened around the bend, only to skid to a halt, a sob catching in my throat. 3 of the creatures crouched in the path, milky eyes shining with feral hunger in the moonlight, waiting for me, hurting me. I was surrounded. Swallowing a whimper, I raised my rifle with leaden arms, sighting on the nearest monstrosity. The darkness swam before my eyes, exhaustion and dread blurring my vision. "Stay back," I croaked, not recognizing my own voice. "Stay back." Click. The rifle's magazine was empty, the hammer falling on air. In my panic, I hadn't reloaded after firing on the ridge. Ice flooded my veins as the terrible reality sank in. I was defenseless. They pounced, a flurry of grasping claws and gnashing teeth. I went down hard, fetid breath hot on my face as jaws snapped inches from my throat. Impossibly strong hands pinned my arms, nails like talons piercing my flesh. A hitching, gurgling snarl issued from a mouth that shouldn't exist as a lumpy gray face loomed over me, milky eyes rolling in an almost human expression of malice. I have no memory of the park rangers finding me, of being carried out of those cursed woods. They tell me I was nearly catatonic, gibbering about monsters wearing human skin, about glowing eyes and bloody bones. I woke up 2 weeks later in the psych ward, the doctors murmuring words like mental break and survivor's guilt, convinced I'd gotten lost in the forest and hallucinated the whole thing, that the hikers I'd been searching for had been torn apart by scavengers after dying of exposure. I knew the truth. They released me once I learned to stop talking about what I'd seen. The nightmares, though, persisted. I'd jolt awake into the pre-dawn dark, the phantom taste of blood and decay heavy on my tongue, convinced the shadows in the corners of my room had eyes. The Park Service fired me not long after. I'd become a liability, jumping at every noise, unable to venture into the backwoods without launching into a hysterical panic. They pitied me, thinking I was just another burnout case. If only they knew. They found the hikers' remains several miles from where I'd encountered the Wendigos, up on a ridge far from the cave. All traces of clothing and gear were gone, scavenged, the rangers said. No tracks, no evidence of the massacre I'd witnessed. Case closed, according to the higher-ups. The whole incident swept under the rug. But they couldn't erase what I knew, what I saw. The Wendigos are still out there, watching from the shadows beneath the pines, waiting for the next unwitting hiker to stumble into their hunting grounds. And I was one of the lucky few to survive an encounter with the creatures. The public would panic if they knew the truth, would stay far away from the forests and mountains, crippling the tourist industry. So the Park Service buries the stories, again and again. Easier to let people believe it's just bears, cougars, let them go out unprepared to face the primal horror lurking in the wild. But I'll never forget. Can't forget. Because when the night is dark and the wind moans through the eaves, I swear I can hear that gurgling, hitching snarl, and I know one day I'll hear it in the flesh again. One day when I venture back into the forest, the way I've always known I would. You see, the Wendigos, we have unfinished business, them and I. And this time, only one of us is walking out of those woods. My name is George Thompson, and I am 62 years old. This is a true story of what happened to me in September of 19. It started subtly, barely noticeable, like a shift in the breeze. Rangers began reporting hikers going missing. No bodies, no signs of struggle. They just vanished off the trails. At first we blamed it on folks getting lost or disoriented. It happens sometimes, especially with city folk who underestimate the wilderness. But deep down, I felt there was something more, like a chill wind coming from a place you couldn't see. Then came the stories from other rangers out on night patrol. They'd claim to hear footsteps in the underbrush when they were out alone, feel like they were being followed despite the silence. One old-timer, a guy named Flynn, even said he swore he saw eyes, big glowing yellow eyes peering back at him from the tree line, disappearing in a blink. The higher-ups laughed it off. Stress, they said. Maybe bad moonshine. But I knew Flynn. He wasn't the type to spook easy or tell tall tales. Something was out there. Something that didn't belong. As the weeks passed, the atmosphere in the park grew tenser. Visitors became scarce, spooked by the rumors that had begun to circulate. Even the wildlife seemed on edge. I'd been a ranger long enough to read the signs of the forest, and everything was telling me to be on guard. One evening in late September, I was closing up a section of the parkway when I stumbled on it myself, the cause for all the unsettling stories. Deep in the woods, off a little used maintenance trail, I found a clearing, and in the center of it, bones, piles of them, gnawed and cracked. At first glance, it looked like the remains of deer, maybe a bear, but as I got closer, my blood ran cold. Mixed in were bones too big, too oddly shaped to be just animals, and scattered amongst the animal remains, torn bits of clothing, a mangled backpack. My heart pounded in my chest. This wasn't natural, not normal at all. I'd seen plenty of predator kills in my time, but nothing like this. The sheer volume of bones, the way they were arranged, it was almost ritualistic. Right then, my radio crackled with Flynn's voice, panicked. He said he was out on the trail, said he saw it, the thing that was making those eyes. Then the audio cut out, leaving nothing but static. I ran. Every instinct told me to go back, get help. But Flynn had been like family to me, and my gut said he was in trouble. Night was falling fast as I followed the trail towards the spot he'd radioed in from. The forest was unnaturally quiet. No chirping of insects, no rustling of small animals. It was as if the entire woods were holding its breath. The only sound was my own heavy breathing and the crunch of leaves under my boots. As I reached the edge of the woods, peering into an overgrown meadow, I saw it. In the waning light, it stood there, the creature. I couldn't make out all the details, but the sheer scale of it was enough to make my knees wobble. It was close to 10 feet tall, covered in matted fur that shimmered silver in the moonlight. Its arms were like tree trunks, its hands tipped with claws that ripped into the earth, and the head that was the worst. A mix of wolf and man, twisted and wrong, with yellow eyes blazing like hellfire. For a heartbeat, we just stood there, frozen. Then it let out a roar that echoed through the mountains, the raw sound of fury and hunger. Flynn cried out from somewhere in the meadow, his voice filled with pain and terror. That snapped me into action. I charged forward, yelling, trying to draw the creature away from wherever Flynn was. It turned, and in the dim light its teeth flashed in a grotesque grin. I heard Flynn scream again, and the sound cut off abruptly. The creature turned back towards me, and for a second I thought about running. But Flynn was out there, maybe even still alive, and that creature wasn't going to let me go without a fight. My heart was a drumbeat in my ears as I raised my rifle. It was more of an act of defiance than actual strategy. I hadn't even reloaded since firing warning shots at a mama bear a few weeks back. This thing, bullets wouldn't even slow it down. Yet, I aimed. The creature stalked closer, its eyes fixated on me. I squeezed the trigger. The shot echoed, useless. It roared and lunged. I braced myself for impact, closing my eyes and waiting for the end. But then, silence. My eyes flew open. The creature had stopped just feet in front of me, its massive form frozen in mid-pounce. Confused, I scrambled back, then noticed what had stopped it in its tracks. A flickering headlamp was bobbing through the trees. Then a voice, gruff and familiar. "Don't move, that thing hates light." It was Old Man Flynn, battered and bleeding, but miraculously alive. He dragged himself into view, one hand clutching the headlamp, the other an old heavy-duty flashlight. As he got closer, the creature hissed and retreated a few steps, its eyes narrowing against the concentrated beams. "Keep those lights on it," Flynn croaked, his face pale. "Come on, move." I didn't need telling twice. Stumbling to my feet, I shuffled towards Flynn. The creature watched, snarling, but the fearsome predator from before seemed held at bay by the harsh light, unable to approach. Flynn collapsed against a tree, and I knelt beside him. His leg was twisted at an unnatural angle, the bone jutting through torn skin. "Hold this!" He thrust the heavy flashlight at me. "Aim it straight at that thing." With shaking hands, I took the flashlight. Its beam seemed to make the creature agitated, keeping it at a distance as I helped Flynn splint his leg, fashioning a makeshift support from branches. The whole time, we kept those lights trained on the predator, its snarls filling the night. When the makeshift splint was secured, Flynn slumped back, exhausted. "They told me I was crazy," he rasped, a dark chuckle rasping in his throat. "Said it was bears, wild cats. Never believed they'd believe this." Suddenly, the creature charged again, a blur of dark fur and aggression. We both screamed, holding the light steady. It stopped short, as if hitting an invisible wall. Then it paced back and forth, watching us with calculating eyes. "Can't hold it forever," Flynn muttered. "Sun's coming up soon, but—" He trailed off, grimacing. We both knew what that meant. We'd be sitting ducks come daylight. That's when I saw it. The fire lookout tower flashing on a distant ridge. An old beacon hardly ever used anymore. Maybe, just maybe. I laid out my plan to Flynn, a desperate gamble at best. He nodded slowly, wincing as he shifted his injured leg. "Crazy enough to work," he grunted. With Flynn providing cover, keeping the creature pinned with the flashlights, I crept backwards into the undergrowth. I had to get to the base of the tower, unseen, if this had any chance. Inch by painful inch I moved, the creature pacing restlessly as it sensed me pulling away. Then I was free of its sight line, scrambling towards the tower on my belly. The base of the tower was an old metal shed filled with outdated equipment and forgotten maps. Inside I struck gold, flares. I grabbed them, heart pounding, then began the terrifying climb up the narrow ladder of the tower. The creature must have sensed the change of elevation because it roared in frustration, scrabbling against the base of the tower as I reached the top. I secured myself, hardened my throat, and fumbled with the flare. Flickering crimson light sparked to life, and with a prayer, I hurled it down. The flare bounced off a rock near the creature and exploded. It screeched, recoiling from the blinding flash. Encouraged, I lit another and another, tossing them into the clearing. The creature thrashed and howled, clearly in pain from the sudden bursts of light. I didn't stop, my hands shaking as I fumbled for the last flare. And then as dawn broke, the creature turned and fled, disappearing into the forest with astonishing speed. When the search team finally arrived, we told them the unbelievable truth. They found footprints larger than any bear, the clearing littered with bones. Whatever that creature was, it was still out there. The aftermath was a blur. Flynn recovered, though he walked with a limp for the rest of his days. I never saw the creature again, but I feel it sometimes. A prickling at the back of my neck, that lingering sense of being watched from the encroaching darkness of the trees. We got transferred, both of us. I moved on, got a desk job pushing paper instead of patrolling trails. Safer, they said. Maybe. But sometimes in the dead quiet of my office, I swear I can smell the rankness of the woods, hear the echoing roar and feel the heat of those burning yellow eyes fixed on me in the deep, unending dark. The official report chalked it up to a rogue bear, maybe rabid. But Flynn and I, we know the truth. There's something out there in those mountains. Something old, something hungry, and God help anyone who stumbles across its path. I'm telling this story now because I'm not getting any younger. People need to know, need to be prepared. If you're ever hiking in the Blue Ridge Mountains and you feel that chill wind, hear those footsteps when there's nothing there, don't hesitate. Run. Run as fast as you can, and pray it isn't already too late. Because in those ancient forests, where the shadows run deep and the night seems to last forever, there are things that defy explanation. Things that remind us that we're not the top of the food chain. And sometimes, just sometimes, Those things decide to remind us just how small and vulnerable we really are. So next time you're out in the wilderness, enjoying the beauty of nature, remember my story. Keep your wits about you, your flashlight close, and maybe, just maybe, you'll make it out alive if you ever encounter the creature that haunts the Appalachians. The sun hung low in the sky as I hiked into the remote backcountry of the national forest. As a seasoned park ranger, I was no stranger to solo treks deep into the wilderness to check on campsites. But this time felt different somehow. An inexplicable sense of unease prickled at the back of my neck as I walked beneath the swaying pines. I tried to shake it off, attributing my nerves to the recent stresses of the job. Dealing with unruly campers, conducting challenging rescues, never having a moment of true solitude. That's why I had volunteered for this particular backcountry assignment. I craved the peace and quiet of the forest, a chance to clear my head and forget about the outside world for a while. As I approached the designated campsite, my steps slowed. Something was very wrong. I expected to find a couple of tents, the flickering light of a campfire, maybe some backpacks and gear strewn about. Instead, there was only eerie stillness and scattered debris. The tents lay in torn shreds, the nylon fluttering forlornly in the breeze. Tattered sleeping bags spilled out like disemboweled intestines. Cooking equipment was strewn haphazardly across the forest floor, dented pots reflecting the fading light. But it was the dark stains splattered across everything that made my blood run cold. It looked like dried blood. A thorough search of the site revealed no bodies, no injured campers in need of assistance. In fact, there were no signs of human life at all. Just an uncanny emptiness that sent shivers racing down my spine. The forest was unnaturally quiet, devoid of the usual chorus of birds and insects. It felt like a vacuum, like all the air had been sucked out of the world. As the sun dipped below the horizon, blood-red rays streaked the darkening sky. In the gathering shadows, I spotted something peeking out from beneath a bush. A child's teddy bear. One of its glassy eyes was missing, and the soft fur was matted with mud. When I picked it up, I noticed jagged slash marks across the bear's belly, like it had been torn open by impossibly sharp claws. A haunting howl pierced the twilight, echoing through the trees. It sounded too large to be a wolf, and not quite like any animal I had ever encountered. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as primal fear sank its teeth into me. Something was out there in the woods. Something that had attacked this camp and snatched the people in it. Something that defied explanation. And now I was alone with it. As darkness blanketed the forest, I hastily pitched my tent, eager for even the illusion of shelter. My mind buzzed with unanswered questions as I tried to make sense of the scene I had stumbled upon. What could have attacked the camp with such ferocity? Why did it leave no trace of the victims? And that ungodly howl still reverberating in my ears. I had never been a superstitious man, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something unnatural at work here. Something that lay beyond the scope of my park ranger training and knowledge of the wilderness. Needing answers, I pulled out my satellite phone and dialed the number for the park headquarters. The signal was weak out here in the back country, but after a few tries, a grizzled voice crackled through the static. It was Murphy, an old ranger who had worked this park longer than anyone could remember. "Murphy, it's Wilson," I said. "I'm out at campsite Delta 5. There's been some kind of attack. The tents are destroyed and there's blood everywhere, but no sign of the campers." There was a long pause on the other end. Nothing but eerie silence and the hiss of white noise. Finally, Murphy spoke, his voice low and ominous. "Get out of there, son," he said solemnly. "Don't spend the night." A chill ran through me at his words. Murphy had never been one for dramatics or unfounded fear. "Why? What's going on?" I demanded. But the line suddenly went dead, my question echoing unanswered into the night. With a rising sense of trepidation, I dug out my battered park handbook and flipped to the section on the history of the forest. As I scanned the old black and white photos and yellowed pages of text, a particular passage caught my eye. For centuries, the indigenous tribes of the region avoided the dark heart of the forest, believing it to be the domain of malevolent spirits. According to legend, a creature stalks the woods, a shapeshifter that can take on the form of man or beast. The tribes called it the one who walks like us. It is said to possess an insatiable hunger for human flesh, luring lone travelers to their doom. As I read on with mounting dread, I found disturbing accounts of hikers disappearing without a trace over the years, and grisly reports of mutilated livestock on the outskirts of the forest. The Park Service had always dismissed the stories as nothing more than folklore and superstition, but now, faced with the carnage of the empty camp, I wasn't so sure. A twig snapped in the darkness beyond my tent, and I whipped around, my heart hammering against my ribs. I peered into the inky shadows, but saw nothing, just the creaking of branches in the wind. Yet I couldn't shake the skin-crawling sensation of being watched by unseen eyes. Something was out there, lurking. Something ancient and hungry, summoned by the presence of human prey in its forest. And I had walked right into its hunting grounds. I barely slept that night, every rustle of leaves and groan of the wind jolting me awake. Each time I closed my eyes, visions of blood-stained claws and malevolent amber eyes flashed through my mind. When the gray light of dawn finally seeped through the walls of my tent, I wasted no time packing up camp, desperate to put as much distance as possible between myself and the site of the attack. But as I set out along the trail, a grim realization turned my blood to ice in my veins. The signs of the creature's nocturnal hunt were everywhere. The trail was littered with the tattered remains of small animals. Rabbits, squirrels, even a fawn. Crimson blood painted the leaves and soft white tufts of fur drifted on the breeze. It was as if the entirety of the forest's fauna had been slaughtered in the night. And yet the carcasses were only half-eaten, the kills seemingly abandoned in haste, as if whatever had butchered them was saving its appetite for something else, something larger. With a mounting sense of dread, I realized the truth. It wasn't hunting the animals, it was hunting me. I quickened my pace, my boots pounding against the dirt path. The feeling of being watched intensified, unseen eyes boring into the back of my skull. I whirled around, scanning the dense undergrowth for any sign of movement, but the forest remained still and silent. Too silent. The usual chattering of birds and insects was eerily absent. The only sound, the hammering of my own heart. It was as if every living creature sensed the presence of an apex predator and made itself scarce. Every living creature except me. As I marched onward, a creeping sense of wrongness pervaded the air. The shadows of the trees seemed to shift and flutter in my peripheral vision, even when the wind was still. And the footprints, at first I thought they were bear tracks, large and pressed deep into the soft soil, but as I studied them closer, a shiver ran down my spine. They were distinctly human in shape, but no human foot could possibly be that massive. No human could have left gashes in the bark of the trees, as if clawed hands had raked down the wood. My radio crackled to life, startling me so badly I almost dropped it. Murphy's voice hissed through the static, low and urgent. "Wilson? Wilson, do you read me?" "I'm here," I responded, my own voice shaking. "Listen carefully. You need to get to the ranger station on the North Ridge. Don't stop for anything. Stay off the main trails and watch the trees." "What? Why? Murphy, what the hell is going on?" "No time to explain. Oh God, they're coming." A blood-curdling scream pierced through the radio and then cut off abruptly, plunging me into silence once more. Ice flooded my veins as a chilling realization crystallized in my mind. The creature wasn't just hunting me. It was herding me deeper into the wilderness, away from any hope of help or rescue. And I had played right into its clawed hands. With Murphy's terrified warning still ringing in my ears, I abandoned the trail, plunging into the dense underbrush of the forest. Thorny branches clawed at my face and arms as I crashed through the foliage, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I had no idea where I was going, only that I had to get away from the main paths, away from whatever had taken the old ranger. But with each step, the sense of being stalked only intensified. The shadows grew longer, darker, taking on a miasma of menace. Low-hanging mist curled around the bases of the trees, obscuring the ground. It was like the forest itself had transformed into a living nightmare. And then I saw it. A jagged fissure cleaving the earth. Like a gaping wound. A narrow cave entrance yawning open at the base of a cliff face, half hidden by a veil of moss and vines. Desperation overrode caution, and I darted inside, hoping the dank shadows would conceal me from the horrors without. But as I pressed myself against the clammy cave wall, trying to quiet my ragged breathing, my feet slid on something slick and wet, In the faint light filtering through the entrance, I looked down. The cave floor was a lake of blood. Crimson liquid seeped between my fingers where my hand was braced against the stone. As my eyes adjusted to the gloom, the walls came into focus. They were covered with deep gouges, the rock itself lacerated by vicious claws. Bits of torn flesh and tufts of hair clung to the stone, some still oozing fresh blood. Oh God, this wasn't a cave. It was a feeding den. A keening whimper echoed from the darkness ahead. The unmistakable sound of human suffering, hard in my throat. I crept forward, dreading what monstrous scene awaited me. The narrow tunnel opened up into a larger cavern, lit by an eerie phosphorescent glow emanating from clusters of bioluminescent fungi clinging to the walls. Their spectral light illuminated a sight that will forever haunt my nightmares. People, or what was left of them. A dozen terrified campers cowered against the far wall, their clothes shredded and skin streaked with gore. Their eyes were wild with primal terror, staring fixedly at the shadows as if they expected a demon to materialize out of the dark at any moment. And between me and the pitiful survivors, the cave floor was littered with gnawed bones and shreds of human remains. I had found the missing campers, but I was far, far too late. A piercing shriek shattered the subterranean stillness, so loud it made my ears ring. But it hadn't come from any of the survivors. It came from the tunnel behind me, a frenzied, furious howl of bloodlust and hunger that no natural creature could ever produce. I spun around just as a hulking silhouette filled the cave mouth, blotting out the faint daylight. In the luminous fungal glow, I caught a glimpse of matted fur, wickedly curved claws, and slavering jaws lined with needle-sharp teeth. Eyes that glowed with malevolent amber light locked onto mine. It had found me, and now there was nowhere left to run. The creature stalked into the cavern, its massive bulk scraping against the stone walls. In the eerie light, I could see the grotesque details of its form, half-glimpsed horrors solidifying into nightmarish clarity. It moved upright like a man, but there was nothing human in its gait or proportions. Matted, shaggy fur covered its body, dark and wet with the blood of its prey. Mud and bits of flesh caked its forelimbs, ending in clawed hands with a grotesque semblance of humanoid fingers. The head was a horror of savage jaws and lupine features twisted into a leering rictus grin, the maw crowded with yellowed fangs. But the eyes, dear God, the eyes. They glowed with infernal amber light, burning with a feral, predatory hunger. And yet deep within those hellish orbs lurked a spark of cruel, malevolent intelligence. This was no mere animal, no mindless beast. There was a wicked, calculating cunning in its gaze, a consciousness that understood its own monstrous nature and relished in it. Primal, gibbering terror seized me as my brain struggled to process the sheer wrongness of its existence. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to flee this towering abomination that defied all natural law. But my legs remained rooted to the stone, unwilling or unable to move. Behind me, the survivors erupted into hysterical shrieks, their tenuous hold on sanity shattering at the sight of their tormentor. They gibbered and convulsed against the cavern wall, clawing at their own flesh in the grip of overwhelming horror. The creature's unnaturally intelligent gaze flicked from me to the survivors and back again, a note of cruel amusement flickering across its grotesque features, as if it savored the all-consuming fear it inspired. A rasping, guttural sound emanated from its throat, a perverse approximation of human laughter. It was toying with us, prolonging the terror, relishing our agonized despair before the inevitable slaughter. The stench of it filled the cavern, an overpowering musk of wet fur, rancid meat and coppery blood. It swept over me like a fetid wave, gagging me. As the creature took another step closer, its foul breath washed over my face, reeking of carrion and death. In that moment I knew with numb certainty that none of us would leave this cave alive. We had stumbled into the lair of an impossible nightmare made flesh, and now we would be ripped apart for its savage amusement. The face of the creature filled my vision, its dripping jaws yawning open wide. Its massive clawed hand reached for me, and all conscious thought fled my mind, replaced only by the purest, most primal horror I had ever known. An involuntary whimper escaped my throat as I stared into the depthless abyss of those amber eyes, my sanity unraveling. This was no legend, no mere campfire tale. It was real, and it was here to claim me. The creature's claws closed around my throat, piercing deep into the flesh. White-hot agony lanced through me, as it lifted me into the air as effortlessly as a child lifting a doll. My feet kicked fruitlessly against its bulk as my lungs strained for air. Through the haze of pain and asphyxia, I saw it raise its other arm, razor talons glinting in the spectral light. I braced myself for the killing blow, for the feeling of those wicked claws tearing into my belly. But it never came. Instead, the creature flung me aside contemptuously. I hit the cave wall with bone-jarring force and crumpled to the blood-slick floor, gasping for breath through my bruised windpipe. It had batted me away like a cat toying with a mouse, more interested in prolonging my suffering than granting me a quick death. Through tear-blurred eyes, I watched in numb horror as the creature turned its attention to the survivors. Their screams reaching a fevered pitch, they scattered like frightened rabbits before a wolf, scrambling over one another in a fruitless attempt to flee. The creature lunged, a lightning strike of fur and fangs. Bones crunched and flesh tore as it seized the nearest camper, his howls of terror abruptly turning to wet gurgles. Crimson blood splattered the cavern walls. I tried to crawl away, to drag myself towards the tunnel, but my body wouldn't cooperate. Fractured ribs shifted agonizingly with each labored breath, and my limbs trembled uncontrollably, weakened by shock and blood loss. As I lay there semi-delirious from pain and barely clinging to consciousness, I noticed something I hadn't seen before in my panic. Objects scattered across the cave floor, partially obscured by the glutinous puddles of gore. Shredded backpacks, torn articles of clothing, broken glasses and smashed smartphones, abandoned walking sticks and dented camping cookware, all scattered haphazardly amidst the carnage, a grotesque testament to the dozens of lives snuffed out in this subterranean butcher shop. With a sudden chill, I realized the magnitude of the creature's predation. This wasn't a one-time hunt. The sheer volume of victims' belongings evidenced a long, grisly history of snatching hapless campers from the wilderness above and dragging them down to this bloody den to be consumed at its leisure. How many people had vanished over the years, their disappearances attributed to bear attacks or getting lost in the forest? How long had this nightmare been allowed to persist undetected? Amid the personal effects, I spotted something else. Shards of bone too large to belong to local wildlife, the stripped skulls and rib cages of the creature's previous human prey. Bile rose in my throat as I realized we weren't just its latest victims, we were to be the next servings in an ongoing horrific feast. An overwhelming sense of despair and hopelessness crushed me. How could anyone possibly stand against a thing like this? A ravenous, cunning abomination that made a mockery of the natural order. It had survived this long by being the perfect predator, avoiding detection and snatching the unwary. Behind me, the dwindling shrieks of the survivors underscored the futility of fighting back. Even if I could muster the strength to stand, I had no weapons, no means of defense, and the unnatural strength and speed of the creature would make any physical confrontation a laughably one-sided affair. It would toy with me, batting me around until it grew bored, then tear me limb from limb. One of the campers staggered into view, his clothes more crimson than khaki, his face a mask of blood and raw agony. He stumbled a few steps, glassy eyes unfocused, then pitched forward across a jumbled pile of gnawed bones. He didn't rise again. The stench of gore was overwhelming now, inescapable. The reek of opened viscera and the pervasive copper tang of spilled blood. It coated my tongue, clogging my nostrils. The world wavered around me, my hold on consciousness slipping. I knew shock was setting in, my body shutting down in the face of unrelenting trauma. As the blood-stained cave walls swirled around me, my last despairing thought was that I would never leave this place. I would end as just another collection of shattered bones in the creature's charnel house, my existence erased, my remains mingling with its countless victims. No one would ever know what fate befell me. The darkness reached up to claim me then, a tide of merciful oblivion drawing me under. I hoped I wouldn't awaken again, that the fall into blackness would be my last. Better that than to endure one more moment in this den of horror, awaiting my inevitable gruesome end. Pain dragged me back to waking nightmare, my battered body a chorus of agony. For a single blessed instant I imagined I had dreamed the horrors of the creature's lair, but the putrid stench and sticky wetness saturating my clothes shattered that fleeting fantasy. Groggy and concussed, I raised my head. The cavern was utterly still now, silent save for the slow plunk of blood dripping from stone. Shredded, gory pieces of the other campers lay strewn about like macabre confetti. Of the creature itself, I saw no sign. I knew better than to hope it had simply left. More likely it was toying with me, a cat grown bored with a broken mouse, content to let its prey twitch and suffer a bit longer before pouncing again. Even so, the instinct to survive, to flee this charnel house, drove me to attempt escape. Biting back a groan, I pushed myself upright on trembling arms. Fighting a wave of dizziness and nausea, fractured bones ground together and torn muscles shrieked in protest as I staggered drunkenly to my feet, nearly pitching face first into a pile of intestines. Wiping blood from my eyes with a shaking hand, I shambled towards the tunnel that had brought me into this abyss. The rational part of my mind knew it was futile. In my deteriorated state, I'd be lucky to drag myself a dozen paces before collapsing. But the primitive animal part of my brain, the part that gibbered in wordless fear and operated on base survival instinct, insisted I try. I had to move, had to put some distance, however minuscule, between myself and the chamber of horrors at my back. Wheezing for air, I limped into the dank tunnel. One hand braced against the stone to keep myself upright. The farther I staggered from the cavern, the deeper the gloom became. The meager illumination from the bioluminescent fungi faded behind me, plunging my path into inky, nearly tangible darkness. And with the darkness, a sense of malevolent watchfulness intensified, a skin-crawling certainty of being observed by unseen, inhuman eyes. I couldn't explain it, but some primal, instinctive part of me felt the creature's presence like a physical weight, an aura of pure malice stalking me from the shadows. I was navigating more by touch than sight, feeling my way along the clammy rock, when my groping fingers found an unexpected hole in the cavern wall, some side fissure or natural shelf I hadn't noticed before. And within that alcove, rectangular shapes, artificial edges, the distinctive texture of waxed canvas and synthetic fabrics, more abandoned belongings of previous victims, stashed away like obscene trophies or a predator's cache of leftovers. Revulsion coiled through me at the thought of how many lives had ended here, but beneath that disgust, a sudden ember of hope flared to life. If these objects had once belonged to campers, hikers, perhaps park personnel. My questing hands closed around cool metal, a heavy-duty flashlight of the type often clipped to rangers' backpacks. Hands trembling with desperate haste, I fumbled for the switch. Sudden radiance exploded through the tunnel as the beam flared to life, banishing the concealing dark. And in that brilliant flare of illumination, two things happened simultaneously. The first was that I saw the exit, the tunnel mouth opening back into the forest twilight, no more than a dozen yards ahead, so close I could smell the fresh air and moldering leaf litter. The second was that the light glinted off dozens of eyes just behind me. Inhuman, animal eyes gleaming with reflected radiance and savage hunger. An entire pack of them, the creature somehow multiplied and lying in wait, allowing its prey to crawl along in false hope only to cut off any escape. In the frozen instant before the light shook from my grip as pure terror seized my muscles, before the flashlight shattered on the stone and plunged me back into Stygian blackness mere inches from the monster's matted fur and hot carnivorous breath, a single numb realization crystallized in my mind with perfect horrifying clarity. It had never been just one creature. There had always been more stalking the forest, more lurking in lightless tunnels, an entire lineage of preternatural predators as cruel as they were cunning. Not a solitary nightmare, but a pack, a family, perhaps even a species. And they had been here all along, woven into the folklore and history, a darker truth dismissed as mere legend, as isolated disappearances, as mysteries destined to remain unsolved. The true horror crashed over me in the instant before the flashlight died. Not only had I never stood a chance, but no one else did either. And now, in this isolated darkness far beneath the forest, I would pay the price for my ignorance. Months passed and my physical wounds healed, while the emotional trauma lingered like a malignant cancer, omnipresent and inescapable. In my dreams, I still felt the splintered ends of my own ribs pressing into my lungs with each gasping breath, heard the wet shredding sounds of rendered meat, tasted the coppery slick of blood and viscera on my tongue. Other sensations intruded into my grim memories. The screams of the injured creature as in a final surging burst of desperate strength, I snatched a claw-tipped walking stick from the detritus of previous victims and smashed the improvised weapon into the monster's eye sockets, the splintered end puncturing gelatinous orbs and piercing the abomination's brain. But even then, staggering over a still twitching corpse and clawing my way up the tunnel to a terrified knot of survivors. I knew this was not the end. My flashlight beam cutting through the shocked, blood-drenched faces revealed no triumph or relief, only the same certainty I felt, that the nightmare was only just beginning. Killing one of their number would only draw the pack's ire. Now they knew we could hurt them, maim them, even slay them. The unspoken promise hung in the shadowed air. They would be back, not to feed but for vengeance. In the surreal days that followed, a succession of blandly indistinguishable officials debriefed us in eerily hushed tones, more concerned with suppressing public awareness than grasping the true terror of our warnings. I watched a flimsy cover story take shape, dismissing the whole incident as a rare bear attack exacerbated by isolation-induced mass hysteria. Any evidence to the contrary vanished into locked files and redacted documents. The forest itself whispered of a cover-up, an unspoken collusion to bury a truth too terrible to acknowledge. We survivors clung to each other, finding a measure of solace in our shared scars, both visible and intangible. But at every rustle of leaves or snapping twig, we flinched, an involuntary spasm of hyper-vigilant dread. The creatures were still out there, after all, hungry, cunning, and now enraged. It was only a matter of time before more went missing, before some unprepared soul wandered down the wrong forest path and vanished forever into fang and shadow. In that unspoken certainty, a grim resolve crystallized within our fractured psyches. We could not unsee what we had witnessed, could not unknow the primal horror stitched into our cellular memory, and we would not, could not, simply wait for the inevitable next chapter of the nightmare to play out. So we prepared, quietly, discreetly. We amassed what weapons we could, what esoteric knowledge we dared to seek out. Silver bullets and blessed blades, eldritch sigils and protective wards drawn from the dustiest annals of folklore and occult whispers. No authority would ever officially acknowledge what stalked those woods, let alone mount an armed response. But we knew. We remembered. And though we were no one's idea of an army, still we set ourselves to a sacred secret mission, to guard the unwary from suffering our fate, to hunt the monsters that would make prey of humanity. Perhaps it's a hopeless endeavor in the end. An unwinnable war waged in shadows and silence against an enemy that has lurked in lightless places for generations uncounted. But what choice do we have save to fight until we fall? We cannot unsee, cannot forget, cannot do nothing. For now, we walk in the footsteps of the lost, knowing that somewhere out there the pack still prowls, licking old wounds and watchful for new prey. But this time, the hunted may yet become the hunters. This time, at least, they will not feed unopposed. We are the unsung survivors, the broken watchers standing against the night. And for the sake of every soul yet to wander beneath those twisting boughs, we pray it will enough. My name is James Walker. This is a true story of events that happened to me in September of 2012, when I was a ranger in Olympic National Park. I've been hesitant to share this account for years, but now, as I approach the twilight of my life, I feel compelled to put these experiences to paper. Perhaps it will serve as a warning, or maybe just a reminder that there are things in this world beyond our understanding. I had been a ranger in Olympic National Park for a little over 5 years when it happened. The job was a perfect fit for me. I loved the rainforests, the remoteness, the feeling that I'd stepped into another world entirely. But there's remote, and then there's the deep-ho rainforest. Miles of old-growth trees dripping with moss. Thick underbrush that seems to swallow sound itself. The kind of place where sunlight barely filters through and getting lost is terrifyingly easy. In early September of 2012, I was assigned to trail maintenance in one of the most secluded areas of the park. It was a routine 2-day job meant to be tackled alone. Routine, at least by ranger standards. My first day on the job went about as smoothly as cutting back vines and overgrowth can get. By evening, I'd set up camp in a small clearing near the river, cooked myself a freeze-dried dinner, and settled down with my headlamp and a paperback to unwind before bed. That's when I heard it. It wasn't a bear, not a cougar, not the usual symphony of forest critters settling in for the night. It was something like a sob, choked and desperate, followed by a scuffling sound in the undergrowth. Now protocol is clear when it comes to civilians in trouble. That's when you intervene. But rangers out in the backcountry, you tread lightly, respect the wilderness for what it is. Still, there was something about that sound that set my teeth on edge. I grabbed my rifle, clicked off the safety, and headed in the direction of the noise. The ferns and fallen leaves muffled my footsteps, making the forest seem even quieter after the strange cry. Every creaking branch had me on edge. Up ahead, something thrashed in a thicket of thorny vines. "Hello? Anyone there?" I called out, my voice hoarse in the quiet. No answer came, just an odd rustling sound followed by a flash of movement deeper in the darkness. I took a cautious step forward, my finger resting lightly on the trigger of my rifle. And that's when the thing pounced. It knocked me clean off my feet, a blur of sinewy limbs and foul-smelling fur. I hit the wet ground with a grunt, my rifle skidding away into the underbrush. I got a glimpse of clawed hands, too long for a bear, and rows of teeth, pointed and yellow. But all I really remember are the eyes, big amber and burning with a hate that felt, well, not just animal. It let out a blood-curdling screech and lunged for my throat. I rolled away, fumbling desperately in the damp leaves for my rifle. I found it, twisted as much as I dared with the thing so close, and took a shot, more out of instinct than anything else. The thing recoiled with a howl, a spray of blood marking the tree behind it, but it wasn't down. It circled me, panting heavily, its eyes locked on me like prey. That's when I saw it clearly. Too skinny to be a bear, yet strong enough to have taken a grown man down. Skin stretched over prominent ribs, patchy in places, and mottled a sickly brown. The head was almost dog-like, but elongated and filled with far too many teeth. It stalked me like a predator, but there was more there, an intelligence that set my teeth on edge. I fired again. It flinched, then scrambled further into the undergrowth, vanishing in seconds amidst the shadows of the trees. Shaking, I got to my feet, my heart pounding like a war drum. I had to get out of there. Radioing in to report the incident was met with predictable skepticism. It took 3 days, a team of rangers armed to the teeth, and an awful lot of blood splatter on the forest floor before they believed what I saw out there. They never found the creature. Said it must have been a sick bear, or maybe a coyote with mange playing mind games with me. I transferred shortly after that, took a desk job up in Seattle. I haven't even liked going on hikes lately, the trees closing in too tight. But every now and then at night, when the city noise subsides, I swear I hear that screech again, and then I see those eyes, glowing in the darkness just beyond my window. It's been over a decade since that night in Olympic National Park, but the memory hasn't faded. If anything, it's grown sharper, more insistent. I've tried to rationalize it, to explain it away as the product of fear and isolation. But deep down, I know what I saw was real. I'm not the only one with a story like this. Over the years, I've heard whispers, fragments of similar encounters from other rangers, hikers, and backwoods folk. They don't talk about it openly. Who would believe them? But in quiet corners of bars, around dying campfires, the stories come out. There was Elias Harper, a ranger in the Great Smoky Mountains. His story reached me through the grapevine, passed along by a mutual friend who knew we'd both seen something. Elias's encounter happened in October of 2016, 4 years after mine. The details were different, but the core of it, the otherworldly menace, the primal fear, that was the same. Elias told it like this: "I'm a national park ranger working in the Great Smoky Mountains. Love the views up here, but man, these woods go on forever, and half the time you can't see 10 feet through the fog. Perfect recipe for folks getting themselves lost. Got the call about a missing hiker around dusk. Young guy, early 20s, on a solo trip. Last checked in at a ranger station further into the backcountry, and never made it to his planned campsite. Cell service out here is spotty at best, so it wasn't uncommon for people to go off-grid for stretches. But a storm was brewing, and rangers don't take chances. I suited up, headed out. The trail wound through thick forest, dripping with mist and shadowed by ancient trees. Rain began to fall, a cold, insistent drizzle. Found his discarded pack a few miles in. It was torn open, gear scattered like he dumped it in a panic. I knelt by a shredded energy bar wrapper, frown deepening. Didn't look like a bear attack. Bear scat's easy to spot, and they usually leave most of the inedible stuff undisturbed. What I did find were tracks, big ones. Too wide for a human, and the toes were splayed out strangely. A chill unrelated to the rain snaked down my spine. We get mountain lions up here, but something about the size and shape of these prints felt wrong. Followed those tracks deeper into the woods. The rain picked up, washing away any clearer trace, but I knew I was on the right path. Panic gnawed at my gut. If it was a big cat, the weather would flush it out into the open, same as the hiker. We were both in danger, only I had a radio and a rifle. The forest floor sloped downwards, leading towards a shadowy ravine. As I got closer, the smell hit me, blood and wet fur mixing with that same rotten chemical stink that had been haunting my nightmares ever since. Well, that's a whole nother mess. But trust me, once you smell that, you don't ever forget it. The ravine snaked through the trees, and I moved silently along the high ground, tracking whatever had made those prints. Then ahead of me, movement. A flicker of something pale and unnaturally large hunkering beneath a jutting rock. I crouched lower, heart pounding against my ribs. That's when I saw it. Truly saw it. Not a mountain lion. This thing, it was humanoid, but only vaguely. Too tall, too lean, its skin hanging loose on a knobby frame. Its head was like a misshapen skull with yellow eyes that burned like embers in the gathering gloom. Claws, long as a man's fingers, dug into the carcass of what used to be the missing hiker. I fought back bile, raised my rifle with trembling hands. I was a decent shot, but this was beyond any training they give you at the academy. Had to make this first one count. Lined up the sights, took a deep, steadying breath. Then the damn flashlight flickered. Must have gotten knocked loose when I dropped my pack back at the campsite. The beam of light swung wildly, illuminating the creature for a horrifying second. It shrieked, a sound like metal scraping against stone, and reared back, shielding its eyes. It dropped the remains of the hiker and lunged toward me, moving with a speed that defied its skeletal frame. I fired once, twice, the rifle bucking hard against my shoulder. It flinched, roared, but it kept coming. I only had time to scramble back a few steps before it was on me. A force like a runaway truck slammed into my chest, sending me sprawling backward. I hit the earth hard, rifle flying from my grasp. The creature loomed above me, its fetid breath washing over my face. I fumbled for my backup pistol, fingers clumsy with fear and cold. It raised a clawed hand to strike. Somehow I managed to roll, the blow narrowly missing my skull but tearing open my shoulder. I scrambled back, scrabbling desperately for a weapon. Anything. The creature snarled, stalking forward. Pain seared through me, and my vision blurred around the edges. This was it. This was how it ended. A sudden beam of intense light cut through the forest gloom, so bright it made me flinch. The creature jerked back, hissing, the light stinging its eyes. Confused but desperate, I swung my own flashlight around. Another beam joined mine from further down the slope, accompanied by a familiar voice yelling my name. Reinforcements, finally. The creature, caught between our flashlights, whirled in a frenzy of snapping claws and gnashing teeth. Its skin began to smoke where the light touched it, a sickening smell filling the air. And then, with a final howl of rage, it turned and vanished into the undergrowth, the sounds of its retreat muffled by the pounding rain and the roaring pulse in my ears. My fellow rangers, Edie and Walker, found me slumped against a tree, bleeding and gasping for breath. Their faces were a mix of relief and horror when they saw the claw marks raking my shoulder. Edie patched me up as best she could, while Walker swept the area, found my rifle further down the ravine, but no sign of the creature. It took two of them to haul me back down the trail to the main road. They kept throwing nervous glances over their shoulders, flashlights cutting through the darkness. Every rustle of branches, every echoing hoot of an owl made us jumpy. It wasn't until the flashing lights of the ambulance came into view that I began to relax the death grip I had on my pistol. At the hospital, they stitched me up, ran every test imaginable, and then came the questions.
Park Service? Local cops?
They all wanted details. I stumbled through a description of the creature, doing my best to stick to the facts, avoid sounding like a lunatic seeing monsters. They exchanged uneasy looks. I could read it in their eyes. They didn't fully believe me. Word must have leaked because soon enough the reporters descended. Questions about the missing hiker, the animal attack. I stuck to my line. Injuries attributed to falling during the rescue mission. Can't have the whole world thinking there's some unholy beast roaming our national parks. They bought the story, at least officially. The aftermath was a blur. Weeks of physical therapy for my torn-up shoulder. Nightmares that jolted me awake, sweating and gasping. I went back to work eventually, but everything had changed. Every hike, every patrol, I scanned the trees, not for lost hikers, but for those glowing yellow eyes and the stench of decay. And there were rumors, whispers among the other rangers. A sighting of a strange, emaciated figure near a campsite. A string of shredded tents blamed on wild animal activity. Or that whisper about the lone hiker who went missing deep in the backcountry, leaving behind only a single monstrous footprint in the mud. Nobody ever connected the dots officially, of course. One night I was on a late patrol when I encountered Edie at a crossroads deep in the park. She didn't say a word, just passed me a thermos of strong coffee and a sealed envelope. Didn't need to ask what was inside. Silver bullets, hand-loaded. Not standard issue for park rangers, that's for sure. She met my gaze, the unspoken understanding clear in her eyes. "After what you saw," she said, her voice low. "Figured you could use these. Be careful out here, Elias." The knowledge that I wasn't alone in this, that helped, some nights at least. But there was also a growing certainty. This wasn't over. That creature was still out there. Call it a Wendigo, a demon, whatever those old stories named it. The fact remains, there's something preying on the lost and alone in these mountains. One day maybe I'd track it down, put an end to its reign of terror, but that felt like a fool's hope. See, the thing about fighting monsters is, they fight back. And sometimes they win. One foggy morning, a shredded backpack turns up or a hiker vanishes on a familiar trail, and I'm left wondering if it got another one. Meanwhile, my own life's on hold. Got a half-healed scar, a beat-up old truck, and a growing collection of high-powered flashlights. No wife, no kids. Can't drag anyone into this mess. Sometimes I think about leaving the mountains, try getting lost in a big city crowd for a while, see if I could just disappear. But then I remember the faces of the missing. The way that young hikers' torn-up gear was strewn across the trail. The look in Edie's eyes when she handed me those bullets. And something stubborn and stupid inside me digs in. So I stay, keep my gear ready, rifle cleaned, and an extra flashlight within reach at all times. Every time I drive along the park roads, every time I head into the woods, the weight of responsibility settles heavy on my shoulders. Feels less like a job now, and more like a war. A war most folks don't even know is happening. And out there, under the old trees and shrouded in the mountain fog, it waits. The creature with the glowing eyes and the unending hunger waits for the next lost hiker, the next overconfident camper, the next ranger who stumbles upon its shadowed domain. Some nights lying awake in my cabin with the rain rattling the roof and the wind sounding like a mournful howl, I wonder who it will be waiting for when I inevitably fail. When my flashlight flickers or my aim misjudges or it finally catches me unaware. And who, if anyone, will take up the fight when I'm gone. Maybe someday this story will get told after it's too late for me. Maybe some younger ranger, green and brave and foolish like I used to be, will find this account. If that's you, whoever you are, well, good luck, kid. You'll need it. Because trust me, the monsters are real. The battle will never end. And if the shadows in the woods seem a little deeper, those glowing eyes in the distance a little brighter, the rustle of leaves a little closer, best keep your wits sharp and your flashlight ready. You might just be the next line of defense against the things unseen. As I, James Walker, sit here in my Seattle apartment looking out at the city lights that never quite banish the darkness, I can't help but feel a connection to Elias and all the others who face the unknown in the wilderness. Our stories may differ in the details, but the core truth remains the same. There are things out there, things beyond our understanding, and they're hungry. I've often wondered if I should have stayed, should have fought like Elias did. But fear got the better of me. I ran from the forests, from the responsibility. Yet even here, surrounded by concrete and steel, I can't escape the memory of those eyes, that unholy scree. I've often wondered if I should have stayed, should have fought like Elias did, but fear got the better of me. I ran from the forests, from the responsibility. Yet even here, surrounded by concrete and steel, I can't escape the memory of those eyes, that unholy screech. Sometimes, on particularly dark nights, I find myself reaching for a flashlight, peering out into the city shadows, because deep down, I know the truth that Elias and others like him face every day. The monsters are real, and they're not confined to the wilderness. They're out there waiting, watching, and whether we choose to face them or not, their hunger never ceases. So to anyone who reads this, remember, stay vigilant, trust your instincts, and always, always keep a light nearby. The battle against the unseen may never end, but as long as there are those willing to stand against the darkness, there's hope.